our very own Phil Mackey, he's the Mackey and Judd with Ramie, says he's been doing some insiding and has some info on the Minnesota Timberwolves search for a new president of basketball operations.
Reckless speculation.
It's not reckless. Judd's snickering at my reporting here.
Well, I'd like to know what we're in for here. Like, so it's not reckless, but you are going to extrapolate your premise, I would guess, and
Yes.
then make it reckless.
So I'm just going to go through a few things that I've learned, just trying to come up with some information here, because we're down to 4. It sounds like 4 finalists that we know of. And I threw the 4 finalists at somebody who would very much know. And their thought was any of these 4 would take the job if offered. So Trajan Langdon, Chauncey Billups, Calvin Booth, and I believe it's pronounced, is it Gersson Rosas?
Mm-hmm.
One of those names
Rockets,
I've seen.
right?
Yeah. He's been with the Rockets for most of the last 2 decades, actually. He was part of the Yao Ming and Tracy McGrady Rockets, and then he's been a centerpiece of their front office next to Daryl Morey in building the revolutionary 3-point Rockets. So thing number 1 to point out, we all wondered why Ethan Casson was the one. So he's the CEO of the Timberwolves. He just took that job within the last couple of years. I believe he's been there for 2 years now as the CEO. And you and I had Ethan on inside Skyway a couple of years ago, and I chatted with him for a while, and seems like a really sharp guy, and just a guy that he came from the San Francisco 49ers. But when we read the story that Ethan Casson was the one, along with Scott Layden and no Glenn Taylor, that went into Tom Thibodeau's office and pulled the trigger on that firing, was that you? Were you here at the time of that, Ramie, or was that
I don't
right
think
before
so.
you
That
got
was right
here?
before I came, yeah.
Because we talked on this show, and it was like, that's really interesting.
It was like January 7th or so.
Because we thought the
Yeah.
pecking order of the organization was Glenn Taylor, and then Tom Thibodeau, and maybe Ethan Casson on the non-ops side, right?
Right.
But as
he's
it
the
turns out, Ethan,
president. Yes.
yep, Ethan was the one that walked in.
Yep.
And I've heard from multiple people in the know that Ethan not only is spearheading the charge, but like Ethan is fully in charge of this president of basketball operations search. So this is an Ethan Casson search from top to bottom, and he's the one identifying these candidates, bringing them in. He's the one scheduling things, and he's fully just fully integrated and immersed himself into this search. So it seems like there's a shift, either a shift in power in the Wolves organization, or a temporary shift to the point where Glenn trusts Ethan and not a search firm or somebody else to run this whole thing.
As long as it's not Glenn Taylor making the decision, I think that's an encouraging sign, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And just because I'm wondering, because we all sort of look at Glenn and say, don't really trust that guy to run any kind of a search. Like, don't really trust that guy to find a cashier at a Wendy's at this point, unless it's Flip Saunders or Ryan Saunders. So I asked, what is the general feeling on the way Ethan has been running the search? And again, 2 different people told me. In fact, I'm going to read one of them verbatim just so I don't get this wrong. Ethan is nailing it absolutely out of the ballpark, is what somebody told me, who I trust, who's in the know. And I asked, because the only one of these 3 that I've just never really heard of until this search is Gersson Rosas.
Mm-hmm.
We have opinions on Chauncey Billups because we saw him on the court, we see him on TV. So the 2 that I asked about specifically were Chauncey Billups, because that's the name that I've had in my head, just like anybody else would, and Gersson Rosas. And the information I've gotten back is that people might be overvaluing Chauncey because he's a household name, and I'm definitely guilty of that. If you ask me, gun to the head, which of these 4 would you hire? Well, I don't know, Chauncey, because he seems really smart on TV, right?
Yeah.
But the worry would be not that he'd be a bad hire necessarily, but that he would be a little bit more like Magic Johnson than a top GM.
Okay.
That his name and stature would be the things that we gravitate toward, but the fact that he has no practical management experience or overseeing the development of players on a regular basis like Trajan Langdon has with the Nets, that could be a major downfall.
See, I'm not that worried about that with Chauncey because, like Dan Le Batard said when Magic Johnson got that job, and people killed Dan Le Batard for him. Some even said he was only saying it because Magic Johnson was a black man, but Dan Le Batard turned out to be 100% right. Magic Johnson, his whole post-playing career, short of his business ventures, movie theaters, Starbucks, all that, he's been a very good businessman. But when you talk about getting his own TV show, being an analyst on ESPN, being the coach of the Lakers, then being president of the Lakers. He literally fell backwards into all those jobs for being charming and famous. Chauncey Billups isn't getting anything for being Chauncey Billups. He has some name value, but nobody's hiring him just because he's Chauncey Billups and he comes with fame and charm. He doesn't have enough of that to ease his way into situations the way a Magic Johnson does. I think Chauncey's going to have to earn it. Chauncey's going to have to go through the interview and impress somebody in getting this job, if he's going to get this job.
I like the idea, though, of going and getting a guy who's worked for a very successful franchise for an extended period of time and stealing ideas from there. That's good.
Yeah, at the very least, you get to steal Rockets' ideas, right?
Now, the concern, though, about the intelligence that you're getting back, Phil, is this sounds productive? Because if Glenn sort of shifted off to the side, that's good. And Casson, who I think business-wise is very smart. I have no clue about basketball-wise, but let's say he turns out to be smart. That's good. The concern is it sounds like when the new president of basketball ops is introduced, that it's going to be with Ryan as the coach. And that's the one thing where I keep going back to, no matter what we think of Ryan, and Ryan seems to be a great kid, I really would like that president of basketball ops then to have the ability to say, here's my direction.
Yes.
So that's the one place where I feel like Glenn is still bigfooting a process and it's not being allowed to play out as naturally as I would like.
I would agree with that. Although Doogie was reporting on his Scoop podcast, which you can find on scorenorth.com, as unorthodox as it is, Scott Layden and Ryan Saunders are in some of these meetings and interviews, not to help hire, but so that the president of basketball operations candidate can get to know those two guys.
Yeah,
but couldn't you just do that after he's hired?
Well, I just think that this person should be given a fresh slate
if he wants it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, if this guy's like, I love these guys, that's different. Yeah. But it should be Glenn, unfortunately, because this is not going to be how it plays out. Unfortunately to me, Glenn should not be saying, Ryan's my guy. Glenn should be saying, Ethan identified a very smart basketball guy here, and that person can now go about the process of hiring his GM if he wants a GM, his coach, and go down that list.
Yeah, I would hire the president and then put him in a room with either both of those guys or each of those guys on separate occasions, and then see if he jives with them, if they can make it work, if those are guys he wants as part of his organization. But I'm with Judd. I hate it when you bring in a guy to run the show and the first thing you do is impose things on him to start his tenure of running the show. It just doesn't make any sense. If you're going to hire a president of basketball operations, let them pick their GM. Let them pick their coach. Have Saunders and I'm drawing a blank on the GM now. Scott Layden. Have them be candidates. Just say, hey, look, I want these guys on the list. When you're picking your guys, just give my guys a consideration. And that's all it should be, is a nod and a suggestion that you give them consideration when you're picking your own GM and your own coach.
The interesting thing about Rosas in particular, who's, again, he's the one that's been with the Rockets for like 17 or 18 years. And he did go to the Mavericks for a few months and then came back at a promotion with the Rockets. If they hire Rosas, they're shooting threes. Like, that guy's not coming over under Daryl Morey.
Yes.
And running some sort of antiquated offense. They're shooting threes.
If the Twins and Wolves are both up to date in their sports next season?
Yeah. So I want to just a couple more nuggets here about Rosas in particular, because he's the one that I just didn't know anything about going into this process. I've seen his name a couple times, but really knew nothing about him. And somebody who knows him said he lives by the mantra of winning isn't the answer to solve everything. Winning is the result of doing things the right way. He has a strength guy who is touted as and I don't know if this strength guy would come to the Timberwolves if he got hired or not, but a strength guy that is highly touted for transforming James Harden from being a really, really good all-star player to being an all-time Hall of Fame caliber player through workouts and conditioning and off-season. One of those guys who can drive a superstar to get to another level, which is what Karl Anthony Towns might need. Mm-hmm. And the person I was last exchanging messages with, because one of the questions that shouldn't really matter that much, but it does to some extent. Chauncey Billups could get Kevin Garnett at least back in the good graces and vice versa of the organization. And that's definitely an elephant in the room, that Kevin Garnett, I mean, he did come to a couple games last year, so it looks like the fact that Ryan Saunders was the coach, that there's...
Right, but he doesn't talk to Glenn. There's still a disconnect.
And there are people who know a lot about this search that feel like Rosas could also bridge that gap with Kevin Garnett. He's that
has
type
a
of
relationship with him, or
I don't know if it's that specifically, but he's that type of personality and that type of leader, I guess. Now, Calvin Booth, I don't know what kind of relationship Calvin Booth has with Kevin Garnett.
I would just love to see this whole thing revolve around Glenn backing off as much as possible.
Hire someone that you trust and that's smart. Although he kind of did that with Tom Thibodeau, and then Tom Thibodeau just ran it into the ground. He backed off on Tom Thibodeau and then had to step in and fire him.
Well, he did.
In fairness,
he did. But let's try this again, and let's get a person here who can run the entire show, hire a GM, hire a coach, do PR with KG, because the KG thing is just more symptomatic of how embarrassing this franchise has been and become on an annual basis. He's the greatest player in franchise history without a doubt. And wins and losses are not going to be decided on if his jersey is in the rafters or not. But it's just it's an obvious symptom of the fact that until you can do these things, take these steps, your franchise is just dysfunctional.
I was watching The Jump a couple days, maybe it was yesterday, and Jackie McMullen and Scottie Pippen were the two guests with Rachel Nichols on the show, and it was the day Chauncey Billups was interviewing for the president's job, and Rachel Nichols asked both of them if he would be a good fit for the job, and Jackie McMullen, in much stronger words than Scottie Pippen, said she hopes Chauncey doesn't get the job because the ownership situation. And she didn't say Glenn Taylor by name, but she basically just said the ownership situation is such a mess that you're setting yourself up for failure. You're going somewhere where you can't get the job done and get it done correctly because it's in such disarray here in Minnesota. Do you think that's how this job is being looked at around the NBA?
For a long time, yes. For sure, in the non-Flip Saunders periods of Timberwolves history, and even in some cases when Kevin McHale was running the front office and he was the one that was making all the bad draft picks and overseeing, along with Glenn, the Joe Smith under the table contract. But from what I've heard, all four of these guys would take the job. So I don't think that perception is preventing this crop of candidates from saying yes. But I guess if you go back to the Tom Thibodeau, just 2 years and go out with a flame burst, was Glenn so this is a tough question. Glenn Taylor was at fault for hiring Tom Thibodeau, and Tom Thibodeau ran the organization back into the ground behind the scenes, right? But was Glenn Taylor, if Glenn Taylor would have hired the right president of basketball operations who has a good mind for culture and chemistry and communication and connecting with young people and the modern game of basketball, I don't know if you have the same viewpoint on terrible ownership. Do you? I mean, he's not a good owner, but if he hires the right person to run the organization and backs off, does that make him a better owner?
You take the job probably because of Cat, because you got a generational superstar.
That's what Scottie said. Scottie said the only reason Chauncey or anybody else should take this job is because you walk in with a centerpiece like Cat, and not many guys start the job with that type of leg up.
But to Jackie's point, I agree in this sense. If you sit down and honestly ask yourself the question, do you think that as long as Glenn owns this franchise, it's going to not be a dumpster fire at some point? It's really hard to say yes.
Yeah.
It really is. Like, there's never been a sustained period, and if there was, it's a long time ago now. Can you honestly say to yourself that you think the next person is going to thrive here? And I can't.
If it's the right person, Glenn Taylor won't prevent them from thriving. I think he's just had an impossible time hiring the right person when it's not Flip Saunders. Flip Saunders was thriving, and then he passed away.
Yeah.
Right? That's my thought.